You've been called crazy, told you're too sensitive, accused of seeing things that aren't there, and the person saying this believes it completely. Not because they're lying, but because their mind has rewritten reality to protect them from something they can't bear to see in themselves. And that rewriting, that absolute conviction in a distorted perception, is one of the most dangerous psychological mechanisms Carl Jung ever documented, because the person doing it has no idea they're doing it. And you're about to become the target of everything they refuse to acknowledge in their own psyche. Jung called this shadow projection. And what makes it so devastating isn't the projection itself. It's the projector's complete unconsciousness of what they're doing. They genuinely believe the distorted version of you they've created. Their conviction is so absolute that they'll convince others, build entire narratives, destroy relationships, all while maintaining perfect innocence. Because in their reality, they're not projecting. They're simply seeing clearly what everyone else is too blind to notice. This isn't about misunderstanding. It's not about different perspectives or communication breakdowns. This is about someone's unconscious mind systematically attributing their own denied characteristics to you with such certainty that you begin questioning your own reality. And Jung discovered that this process doesn't just damage relationships. It can destroy your sense of self if you don't recognize what's actually happening. Jung spent decades documenting how the human psyche protects itself from unbearable self-knowledge, how we exile parts of ourselves into what he called the shadow, everything we can't accept about our own nature, our capacity for cruelty, for manipulation, for selfishness, for the very qualities we most despise in others. These aspects don't disappear when we reject them. They accumulate in the unconscious, and the psyche, unable to tolerate their presence in the self, projects them outward onto others. This is shadow projection at its most basic level. You see in others what you can't see in yourself. But Jung observed something far more dangerous than simple projection. He documented cases where projection became so complete, so unconscious, so defended, that the projector's entire reality warped around their need to not see their own shadow. They didn't just misperceive one person. They systematically reconstructed their entire social world to support their projections. And here's what makes this mechanism so insidious. The stronger someone's need to avoid their shadow, the more convinced they become of their projections. It's an inverse relationship. The more unconscious the shadow content, the more certain the projection. The person who projects their cruelty onto you will be absolutely convinced of your cruelty. The person who projects their manipulation will see your every action as evidence of manipulation, and no amount of evidence to the contrary will shake their conviction, because the projection isn't about you, it's about protecting them from unbearable self-knowledge. Jung observed that you can recognize shadow projection through a specific pattern. The accusations don't match your internal experience. Someone attributes thoughts, feelings, motivations to you that exist nowhere in your consciousness. And they do it with complete certainty. Not, I think you might be, but you are, stated as absolute fact about your internal states that only you can actually know. This certainty is the signal. Because if someone actually saw you clearly, they'd have uncertainty, nuance, room for being wrong. But shadow projectors don't have uncertainty. They have conviction. And that conviction creates what Jung would recognize as a dangerous feedback loop. The projection triggers your defense. Your defense is interpreted as proof of the projection. Your attempts to clarify are seen as manipulation. Your authentic confusion is read as gaslighting. Everything you do to correct their perception becomes evidence that their perception is correct. You're trapped in their reality distortion, and the more you struggle against it, the more entangled you become. Jung documented that shadow projection doesn't stay contained between two people, it spreads. The projector, completely convinced of their distorted perception, begins sharing their concerns with others. Not maliciously, but from genuine belief that they're protecting the community from someone dangerous. They describe you in ways that bear no resemblance to your actual character. And because they believe it so completely, because there's no doubt in their presentation, others begin adopting their perception. This is where projection becomes collective. Jung observed how entire groups can organize around one person's shadow projections. How families can turn against a member based on attributed characteristics that exist only in the projector's unconscious. How workplaces can mob someone for behaviors they never exhibited. How communities can destroy individuals based on projected accusations that have no basis in external reality. The mechanism works through what Jung understood as participation mystique, unconscious psychological fusion where people lose clear boundaries between self and other. When someone projects with absolute conviction, they create a kind of psychological pressure field. Others feel compelled to align their perceptions with the projector's certainty rather than trust their own contradictory observations. Because the projector's conviction feels more real than their own direct experience, you've probably witnessed this. Someone in a family or workplace becomes the identified problem. Everyone agrees they're difficult, manipulative, toxic, but if you look closely, you can't find clear evidence of the attributed behaviors. What you find instead is a collective agreement, a shared perception that feels more like group hypnosis than objective observation. This is collective shadow projection. And the person at the center of it is carrying not just one person's shadow, but the rejected shadow content of an entire group. Jung recognized this as one of the most dangerous psychological patterns in human relationships, because the projected upon person is fighting not just misperception, but collective delusion. Every attempt to defend themselves is interpreted through the projection filter. Every clarification becomes evidence of the very manipulation they're accused of. They're isolated, gaslit, systematically excluded. And the group maintains perfect innocence because they genuinely believe they're responding to real threat rather than participating in unconscious projection. But shadow projection isn't the only dangerous mechanism Jung identified. He documented what he called inflation. Where projection attributes shadow content outward, inflation identifies the ego with archetypal content that far exceeds personal capacity for integration. The inflated person doesn't just have confidence. They possess absolute certainty about their own righteousness. They're not just helpful. They're the savior, not just insightful. They're the bearer of truth itself. Inflation appears differently than shadow projection. The projector sees evil in others. The inflated person sees divine purpose in themselves. But both mechanisms share the same root: unconsciousness of the shadow. The inflated person maintains their grandiose self-image by projecting all their limitation, all their ordinariness, all their capacity for wrong onto others. They're not just right, they're incapable of being wrong, because wrong exists only in those who oppose them. Jung observed that inflated individuals are often more dangerous than shadow projectors, because inflation comes with charisma, with apparent wisdom, with the kind of certainty that makes people want to follow. Unlike obvious narcissists who repel people with their grandiosity, inflated individuals often appear spiritually evolved, morally superior, intellectually enlightened. And this apparent elevation makes people submit to their authority, adopt their perspectives, participate in their unconscious dramas without recognizing what's happening. The inflated person shows specific patterns Jung documented repeatedly. They never doubt their own motivations, never question their own perceptions, never consider they might be wrong. They interpret disagreement not as useful information, but as evidence of others' moral or intellectual failing. Their conviction creates magnetic attraction while simultaneously eliminating any psychological flexibility. They're absolutely certain, and that certainty, Jung knew, was evidence of profound unconsciousness. Because genuine consciousness, Jung observed, produces humility. The more you actually know about the psyche, the more you recognize how much you don't know, how easily perception distorts, how unconscious content infiltrates conscious awareness without detection. The truly conscious person operates with uncertainty, with willingness to be wrong, with recognition that their perception is always partial and potentially distorted. The inflated person has none of this. They operate from what Jung would call identification with archetypal energy. They're not just themselves anymore. They've become possessed by transpersonal content, the eternal savior, the divine judge, the bearer of cosmic truth, and this possession eliminates normal human ambiguity, replaces it with absolute conviction that can be devastatingly persuasive to others. Jung warned that inflation always eventually collapses. The small ego can't sustain identification with archetypal content indefinitely. But before the collapse, the inflated person often causes catastrophic damage, because they act from their absolute certainty, make pronouncements from their assumed authority, judge others from their presumed moral superiority, and people believe them, follow them, adopt their perspectives as truth. Then there's what Jung called persona identification, where someone invests all their psychic energy in maintaining a flawless social mask. The persona is necessary. It's how we navigate social reality. But Jung observed a particular danger when someone becomes completely identified with their persona, when the mask becomes the only identity they recognize. These individuals appear as models of social appropriateness. They always know what to say, how to act, what expressions to wear. They never seem to have bad days or inappropriate reactions. They present as nearly perfect versions of whatever their social context values. And this perfection conceals something terrifying, because all the aspects that don't fit the perfect persona, all the shadow content that contradicts the flawless image, doesn't disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious. Jung documented that persona-identified individuals often experience sudden shadow eruptions, explosive episodes where all their repressed content emerges in destructive ways. The more perfect the persona, the more violent the eventual eruption. Because psychological energy doesn't obey suppression indefinitely, it builds pressure. And that pressure eventually breaks through in ways the conscious ego can't control. You can recognize persona identification through a quality Jung called uncanny perfection. Something feels performed in their presence. Despite technical correctness in everything they say and do, there's an artificial quality, a hollowness beneath the flawless presentation. And they react with disproportionate intensity to any perceived threat to their image. Because the persona isn't just their social strategy, it's become their only recognized identity. Any crack in it threatens their entire sense of self. Jung observed another dangerous pattern he termed possession, not possession in any supernatural sense, but psychological possession where someone's individual identity disappears and they become a channel for archetypal energies beyond their capacity to integrate. You recognize this state through a quality Jung documented repeatedly. The person's personality seems to vanish, replaced by something ancient and impersonal. They might become possessed by the eternal victim, always suffering, always requiring rescue, always the innocent party in conflicts that somehow follow them everywhere, or possessed by the righteous warrior, fighting cosmic battles against evil that only they can perceive, or the divine parent, treating other adults like children who need their guidance and control. The possessed person experiences extraordinary certainty. Normal human ambiguity disappears. replaced by absolute conviction about their role, their purpose, their understanding of reality. And this certainty, Jung knew, was evidence of profound unconsciousness. Because archetypes are transpersonal, they contain both creative and destructive potentials. The same archetypal energy that produces saints produces fanatics. And the person possessed by archetypal content manifests both poles unconsciously. Jung documented cases where possessed individuals committed acts completely contrary to their conscious values, later experiencing amnesia or elaborate rationalizations to explain behavior they couldn't integrate into their conscious self-image, because they weren't acting from their individual consciousness. They were acting from archetypal content that had overwhelmed their ego. And here's what makes possession so dangerous. Archetypes are constellating. They pull others into their orbit. When someone is possessed by the savior archetype, people around them unconsciously organize into roles that support the archetypal drama. Some become disciples. Some become those who need saving. Some become the forces of darkness the savior must overcome. Everyone gets recruited into a transpersonal story they didn't consciously choose to participate in. Jung observed one more pattern that seems less dramatic, but is equally dangerous. What he called repetition compulsion, where someone unconsciously recreates the same painful situations while believing themselves to be victims of cruel fate. This isn't conscious choice. It's unconscious orchestration. The psyche attempting to resolve unintegrated trauma by recreating its conditions. You recognize repetition compulsion when someone consistently ends up in identical painful situations with different people. The details change, but the pattern remains remarkably consistent. They're always betrayed, always abandoned, always find themselves with narcissists or manipulators or people who don't appreciate them, and they're genuinely surprised each time, as if they're victims of destiny rather than unconscious architects of their recurring experience. The danger isn't to the person trapped in repetition. The danger is to those who get recruited into their psychological drama. Without realizing it, you can find yourself playing a role in a story that began long before you met this person. Usually the role of betrayer, abandoner, persecutor, the person who confirms their belief that the world is cruel and people are untrustworthy. Jung observed that people in repetition compulsions unconsciously emit signals that attract precisely those who can help recreate their original traumatic scenarios. It's not conscious manipulation, it's unconscious orchestration, the psyche seeking resolution through recreation. But from your perspective, you're suddenly cast in a role you never auditioned for, expected to follow a script you never agreed to, and punished for not conforming to expectations you had no way of knowing existed. These mechanisms, shadow projection, inflation, persona identification, possession, repetition compulsion, they all share something fundamental: unconsciousness. The person exhibiting these patterns doesn't know they're exhibiting them. They genuinely believe their distorted perceptions, their inflated self-image, their perfect persona, their archetypal certainty, their victim narrative. And that genuine belief is what makes these patterns so dangerous. Because you can't reason with unconscious content. You can't provide evidence that contradicts projection. Can't demonstrate humility to deflate inflation. Can't penetrate persona identification with authenticity. Can't ground possession with logic. Can't break repetition compulsion with rational explanation. These patterns exist below the level of conscious awareness, and they defend themselves against consciousness with extraordinary sophistication. Jung documented specific defense mechanisms that protect unconscious patterns from awareness. When you point out a projection, the projector experiences your observation as attack, proof that you're exactly as hostile as they perceived. When you question inflation, The inflated person interprets your doubt as evidence of your own limitation, your inability to recognize truth when confronted with it. When you notice the artificiality of someone's persona, they react with rage at your boundary violation, your attempt to see beneath their mask. The possessed person doesn't hear your concern. They hear resistance to divine will. The person in repetition compulsion doesn't see your attempt to break the pattern. They see your betrayal following the script they unconsciously expected. Every attempt to bring consciousness to these patterns triggers the very defenses that keep them unconscious. You become incorporated into the pattern you're trying to illuminate. This is what makes these mechanisms so totalizing. They create closed systems that interpret everything as confirmation of themselves. The projector's projection is confirmed by your defense. The inflated person's inflation is confirmed by your doubt. The persona-identified person's mask is confirmed by your discomfort with their artificiality. The possessed person's possession is confirmed by your resistance. The repetition compulsion is confirmed by your eventual participation in the familiar painful outcome. You're facing not just misperception, but self-reinforcing psychological systems that have their own internal logic. Systems that feel completely coherent from inside while appearing obviously distorted from outside. And the person at the center of these systems has no access to the outside perspective. Their unconsciousness is complete. Their conviction is absolute. And your reality becomes collateral damage in their unconscious drama. Jung recognized that the only response to these patterns is consciousness, not the projector's consciousness. That's beyond your control, your own consciousness. Clear recognition of what's happening, what belongs to you and what belongs to them. What's your actual experience versus what's being attributed to you. This consciousness doesn't change the other person, but it protects you from being consumed by their unconscious process. When someone projects their shadow onto you, consciousness means recognizing that their accusations reveal their disowned content, not your actual character. When someone operates from inflation, consciousness means seeing the unconscious grandiosity rather than being convinced by their certainty. When someone shows only persona, consciousness means recognizing the performance without being fooled by its perfection. When someone is possessed, consciousness means distinguishing archetypal content from individual reality. When someone pulls you into repetition, consciousness means recognizing the script before you're locked into your assigned role. This consciousness is simple, but not easy, because these patterns are designed to pull you into unconsciousness. Shadow projection makes you doubt your own reality. Inflation makes you question your own judgment. Perfect persona makes you feel crude by comparison. Possession makes you feel like you're opposing something sacred. Repetition compulsion makes you feel like you've genuinely wronged someone who's only ever been victimized. The pull toward unconsciousness is strong, and maintaining consciousness in the face of someone else's absolute unconscious conviction requires constant effort. You have to keep returning to your own direct experience. Keep distinguishing between what you actually feel, think, intend versus what's being attributed to you. Keep recognizing projection as projection, even when it's presented as clear sight. Keep seeing inflation as compensation for shadow, even when it appears as genuine wisdom. Keep noticing persona as mask, even when it seems like authentic perfection. Jung observed that this kind of consciousness is rare. Most people, confronted with someone else's unconscious certainty, begin adopting that person's perception, not because the perception is accurate, but because unconscious conviction creates psychological pressure that's difficult to resist. The projector's absolute certainty feels more real than your own ambiguous direct experience. The inflated person's grandiose self-assurance seems more valid than your humble uncertainty. The perfect persona appears more together than your acknowledged imperfection. And this is how unconscious patterns spread. how projection becomes collective, how inflation attracts followers, how persona becomes cultural standard, how possession creates movements, how repetition compulsion recreates trauma across generations, one person's unconsciousness pulling others into matching unconsciousness, creating fields of shared delusion that feel more real than individual consciousness. But Jung also documented that consciousness breaks these patterns, not by fighting them, not by trying to convince the unconscious person of their unconsciousness, but by refusing to participate in the unconscious drama, by maintaining clear boundaries between what's yours and what's theirs, by recognizing projection without taking it personally, by seeing inflation without being seduced by it, by noticing persona without demanding authenticity, by identifying possession without trying to ground it, by recognizing repetition without playing the assigned role. This refusal isn't hostile, it's not defensive, it's simply conscious. You see what's happening without becoming what they need you to be. You recognize their projection without becoming the repository for their shadow. You notice their inflation without becoming the inferior they need to maintain their grandiosity. You observe their persona without becoming the authentic mess that makes their perfection necessary. You identify their possession without becoming the evil their archetype requires. You recognize their pattern without becoming the betrayer their script demands. And this consciousness, Jung observed, protects you, not from being targeted. You'll still be projected onto, judged by the inflated, made uncomfortable by the perfect, opposed by the possessed, cast as villain in someone's repetition, but you won't be consumed by it, won't internalize it, won't begin believing their version of you, won't lose yourself in their unconscious drama. Jung spent his career mapping these territories, not to create fear, but to create the possibility of consciousness. Because unconscious patterns only have power in darkness. The moment you recognize shadow projection as projection, it loses its ability to make you doubt your reality. The moment you identify inflation as compensation, it loses its power to seduce you. The moment you see persona as performance, it loses its capacity to make you feel inadequate. The moment you recognize possession as archetypal, it loses its claim to sacred authority. The moment you identify repetition as pattern, it loses its ability to recruit you into familiar trauma. This recognition is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming conscious of unconscious content. Not just your own, but the unconscious content operating in your relationships, your communities, your culture. Learning to distinguish between what's actually happening and what unconscious patterns make appear to be happening. Between direct experience and projection. Between genuine insight and inflation. Between authentic self and performed persona. Between individual reality and archetypal possession. Between present situation and repeated pattern. Individuation in relationship means maintaining your consciousness while surrounded by others' unconsciousness. Seeing clearly while others see through distorted lenses. Knowing your own reality while being told completely different versions of that reality. Trusting your direct experience while being pressured to adopt contradictory perceptions. This isn't easy. But Jung documented that it's possible and necessary. Because the alternative is being consumed, losing yourself in other people's projections, believing their version of you more than your own experience, adopting their certainty over your own ambiguity, performing their expected role rather than living your authentic reality, getting pulled into archetypal dramas that have nothing to do with your individual life, recreating their trauma patterns because you didn't recognize the script before you were locked into it. Jung observed that people who maintain consciousness in the face of others' unconscious patterns develop a particular quality. They become less reactive, less defensive, less consumed by others' perceptions of them, not because they don't care, but because they've developed clear sense of what belongs to them and what doesn't. They can hear projection without internalizing it, can witness inflation without being seduced, can interact with persona without being fooled, can recognize possession without being recruited, can identify repetition without participating. This quality appears as a kind of psychological sovereignty, not isolation from others, but clear boundaries that allow genuine relationship while preventing unconscious fusion. You can care about someone deeply while refusing to carry their projected shadow, can appreciate someone's gifts while recognizing their inflation, can interact with someone's social self while knowing the persona isn't the whole person, can respect someone's intensity while identifying archetypal possession, can have compassion for someone's pain while refusing to play a role in their repetition compulsion. This sovereignty doesn't make you safe from being targeted by unconscious patterns. You'll still be projected onto, still encounter inflation, still interact with persona, still face possession, still get recruited into repetition, but you won't be destroyed by it, won't lose yourself, won't internalize distorted perceptions as truth about yourself, won't mistake unconscious patterns for conscious relationship. Jung recognized that this kind of consciousness is what allows genuine relationship. Because genuine relationship requires two conscious individuals, two people who know themselves well enough to distinguish between their own content and projected content, who maintain their individual reality while connecting with another's individual reality, who can see each other clearly rather than through the distorting lens of unconscious need. But most relationships, Jung observed, don't operate at this level. Most relationships are unconscious arrangements where people use each other to avoid self-knowledge, where one person projects shadow and the other accepts the projection, where one person inflates and the other diminishes, where both perform personas that never quite touch, where archetypal dramas play out unconsciously, where trauma patterns repeat with different actors following the same script. These unconscious arrangements feel like relationship. They can last for years, decades, entire lifetimes. But they're not actually relationship between two individuals. They're choreographed dances between unconscious patterns. Shadow projection requiring someone to carry the shadow. Inflation requiring someone to remain deflated. Persona requiring an audience. Possession requiring believers. Repetition requiring familiar roles to be filled. And when you become conscious in the middle of an unconscious arrangement, the arrangement falls apart, because consciousness disrupts the unconscious choreography. When you stop accepting projected shadow, the projector loses their repository. When you stop being impressed by inflation, the inflated person loses their confirmation. When you stop being audience for persona, the performer loses their validation. When you stop believing possession, the possessed loses their power. When you stop playing the script, repetition loses its familiar outcome. This disruption feels to the unconscious person like you've changed, like you've become cold or distant or difficult. They're not wrong. You have changed. You've become conscious, and consciousness is incompatible with unconscious arrangement. The relationship they thought they had, the one where you carried their shadow or confirmed their grandiosity or applauded their performance or believed their possession or played your assigned role, that relationship is gone. What remains is the possibility of actual relationship, but only if both people are willing to become conscious. If the projector is willing to reclaim their shadow. If the inflated person is willing to recognize their compensation. If the persona-identified person is willing to risk authentic self. If the possessed person is willing to differentiate from archetype. If the person in repetition is willing to recognize and break their pattern. Jung observed that most people aren't willing. Consciousness is too threatening. It requires accepting everything about yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. requires recognizing your capacity for the very qualities you've projected onto others, requires admitting your grandiosity is compensation for felt inadequacy, requires letting your carefully constructed mask fall, requires distinguishing your small self from archetypal identification, requires taking responsibility for patterns you've always experienced as fate. Most people will choose unconsciousness, will find new repositories for their shadow, new audiences for their inflation, new stages for their persona, new believers for their possession, new players for their repetition pattern, and you'll be blamed for the relationship's dissolution, for not being who they needed you to be, for disrupting what felt to them like natural connection. But Jung would recognize what actually happened. You became conscious, and consciousness ended an unconscious arrangement that was never genuine relationship. What feels like loss is actually liberation, freedom from carrying shadow that isn't yours, from shrinking to maintain someone else's inflation, from performing for someone else's need for perfection, from believing someone else's archetypal certainty, from playing roles in someone else's unresolved trauma. This freedom comes with loneliness, because conscious people are rare. Most human interaction operates from unconscious patterns. Shadow projection is everywhere. Inflation is common. Persona is expected. Possession is often mistaken for charisma or spiritual evolution. Repetition compulsion is so normal, it's considered just how life is. And consciousness makes you unable to participate unconsciously in any of it. But Jung also documented that consciousness creates the possibility for something more valuable than unconscious arrangement. Genuine encounter between two conscious individuals. Two people who know themselves well enough to not need the other to carry their shadow. Who are humble enough to not need confirmation of grandiosity. Who are authentic enough to not need to hide behind perfect masks. Who are differentiated enough to not mistake archetypal energy for personal identity. Who are aware enough to not need to repeat trauma patterns. This kind of relationship is rare, but it's real. And it's what becomes possible when you refuse to participate in unconscious patterns. When you maintain your consciousness despite pressure to adopt others' projections. When you trust your direct experience over others' certainty about your internal states. When you recognize patterns operating beyond individual awareness. When you distinguish what's yours from what's being attributed to you. Jung spent his life proving that consciousness is possible, that you can recognize unconscious patterns without being consumed by them, that you can maintain clear sense of self while others project distorted versions onto you, that you can see inflation without being seduced, that you can interact with persona without being fooled, that you can identify possession without being recruited, that you can recognize repetition without participating. This consciousness doesn't make you safe from unconscious patterns, but it makes you free from being defined by them. Free to know yourself independent of others' projections. Free to remain grounded despite others' grandiose certainty. Free to be authentic despite pressure to perform. Free to distinguish archetypal from personal. Free to break patterns rather than repeat them. And this freedom, Jung understood, is what allows individuation. Becoming who you actually are beneath all the projections, all the compensations, all the performances, all the possessions, all the patterns. Your individual reality independent of unconscious arrangements. Your authentic self that doesn't require others' unconsciousness to exist. This is what Jung documented as possible. Not easy, not common, but possible. And necessary for genuine psychological development, for real relationship, for conscious life rather than unconscious choreography, for freedom from being consumed by patterns that operate below awareness, for the possibility of actually knowing and being known rather than endlessly projecting and being projected upon. You're standing in relationship with someone exhibiting these patterns. Shadow projection telling you who you are with absolute conviction. Inflation demanding your diminishment. Perfect persona creating pressure to perform. Archetypal possession recruiting you into transpersonal drama. Repetition compulsion assigning you a role in familiar pain. And you're feeling the pull toward unconsciousness, toward accepting their version of reality, toward believing their certainty, toward participating in patterns you didn't create. Jung's message is simple. Stay conscious. Know what's yours and what's theirs. Trust your direct experience over their projections. See inflation for what it is. Recognize persona as performance. Identify possession as archetypal. Notice repetition as pattern, not to fix them, not to make them conscious, but to keep yourself from being consumed by their unconsciousness. This consciousness is your protection, your freedom, your path to individuation, and your only real hope for genuine relationship, because unconscious arrangements always collapse eventually, but consciousness can sustain, can grow, can create something real. The patterns Jung documented aren't going anywhere. Shadow projection will continue. Inflation will persist. Persona will remain necessary. Possession will keep occurring. Repetition will keep repeating. These are fundamental mechanisms of the human psyche operating below conscious awareness. You can't eliminate them, can't fix them in others, can't make the unconscious world conscious through your own effort. But you can become conscious yourself, can recognize these patterns when you encounter them, can distinguish between what's actually happening and what unconscious mechanisms make appear to be happening, can maintain your own reality despite others' absolute conviction in their distorted perceptions, can refuse to be consumed by patterns you didn't create. And that consciousness, Jung proved, is enough, not to change the world, but to remain yourself in it, to live from individual reality rather than from projected identity, to maintain authenticity despite pressure to perform, to stay grounded despite others' grandiose certainty, to resist possession by remaining differentiated, to break patterns by refusing to play assigned roles. This is what Jung spent his life documenting. The possibility of consciousness in an unconscious world, the capacity to see clearly despite surrounding distortion, the ability to know yourself independent of others' projections, the freedom to be who you are beneath all the patterns operating beyond awareness. You've been called crazy for not accepting their projection, told you're too sensitive for noticing their inflation, accused of being cold for not applauding their persona, condemned for resisting their possession, blamed for not fulfilling your role in their repetition. And Jung would tell you something simple. You're not crazy, you're conscious. And consciousness, in an unconscious world, always looks like madness to those still asleep. But it's the only path to freedom, the only way to remain yourself, the only possibility for genuine relationship, the only hope for individuation. Stay conscious, that's all. Stay conscious. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark. One awakened mind helping another remember. Together, we move beyond the dark.